There is a geometry to naval warfare that does not change regardless of the century or the technology. A warship in open water is a fixed point in a moving threat environment. It cannot hide behind terrain. It cannot disperse into the landscape. It occupies a specific coordinate that can be calculated, tracked, and targeted by anyone with sufficient sensors and sufficient reach. The aircraft carrier, the largest and most capable surface combatant ever built, is also the most visible. Its flight operations generate an electromagnetic signature that passive collection systems can detect at ranges measured in hundreds of miles. Its wake is visible from orbit. Its radar emissions, its communications traffic, its aviation fuel burns. Each one is a data point in an intelligence picture that any serious adversary will spend years building before they ever consider acting on it. The Iranian military had been building that picture for a long time. What they had assembled in the weeks preceding March 9th, 2026, was not a plan to sink USS Abraham Lincoln. Sinking a Nimitz-class carrier is a strategic objective that exists at the boundary between the militarily ambitious and the operationally impossible for a force with Iran's capabilities and inventory. What they had assembled was something more achievable, and from their strategic perspective, potentially more valuable. A plan to demonstrate that the carrier was not invulnerable. To strike it. To create imagery of a burning flight deck that could be broadcast globally as a signal that American naval power in the Persian Gulf was no longer a cost-free proposition. To change the calculation. To make the price of American presence in their maritime backyard high enough that the political will to maintain it might begin to erode. The strike architecture they had designed for this purpose was built around a concept the adversary's planners had studied from every public source available and refined through their own development programs over 15 years. The saturation attack. No single weapon system in the Iranian inventory could reliably defeat the defensive network of a carrier strike group operating at full readiness. What could theoretically defeat that network, or at least degrade it severely enough to allow penetrating weapons to reach the carrier, was a simultaneous mass attack across multiple vectors, multiple altitudes, multiple weapon types, and multiple guidance methods. Enough threats arriving at the same time from different directions that the defensive systems, however capable, would be forced to prioritize, and that, in the act of prioritization, some threats would find gaps. They launched at 3:08 a.m. The first indication that reached the Combat Information Center of USS Abraham Lincoln was a space-based infrared system alert transmitted from a satellite that had been tracking the thermal bloom of ballistic missile motor ignitions from sites in western Iran. The alert reached the ship's Aegis combat system at 3:09 a.m., 37 seconds after the first launch was detected. At 3:09 a.m. and 40 seconds, the tactical action officer in the CIC called General Quarters. The sound of the general alarm through the ship's interior communication system, a sound that has not changed in its essential character since the Second World War, moved through the passageways and berthing spaces and machinery rooms of a vessel carrying 5,000 people, most of whom had been asleep, into an operational posture that the Navy had spent decades rehearsing, and that, in the first seconds after the alarm sounds, still carries the specific electric quality of something that was theoretical until it wasn't. The tactical action officer was a commander who had spent 11 years in surface warfare, 3 previous deployments in the Gulf region, and the past 9 months as the primary air warfare coordinator for the Lincoln Strike Group. She had reviewed the Iranian saturation attack doctrine in the classified threat briefing that had been updated 48 hours before the deployment began. She had run the numbers on her defensive inventory. she had identified the scenarios that concerned her most. The scenario currently unfolding on her tactical display was one of them. What the display showed was not a single threat axis. It was 3 simultaneous axes developing in real time. From the northwest, the ballistic missile tracks 7 distinct reentry vehicles at this point in the engagement, their trajectories resolving into predicted impact points that the Aegis system was already computing intercept solutions against. From the west, at low altitude and subsonic speed, a dense formation of what the radar was classifying as Shahed 136 loitering munitions, the small delta-winged one-way attack platforms that Iran had deployed in large numbers and that presented a targeting challenge specifically because of their small radar cross-section and their tendency to approach in spread formations that stressed the capacity of any fire control system to track and engage simultaneously. From the south, 2 fast-moving contacts that the system had tentatively classified as anti-ship cruise missiles based on their speed, altitude, and flight profile. Sea-skimming, radar-guided, and carrying warheads that had been designed specifically to penetrate the side plating of large surface combatants. The tactical action officer had approximately 14 minutes before the fastest threats reached the outer engagement boundary of her strike group's defensive network. She began allocating. The Aegis system aboard Lincoln and the 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers of the strike group was not a single weapon. It was a distributed network of sensors, data links, and engagement systems that allowed each ship to contribute to a common air picture and to engage threats using weapons fired from any platform in the network, guided by fire control solutions developed by any other platform. The SM-3 Block IIA interceptors, carried by the cruisers, were the weapons assigned to the ballistic missile tracks. Their hit-to-kill design made them the appropriate tool for the high-altitude, high-velocity reentry vehicles now arcing toward the strike group from the northwest. The SM-6 extended-range missiles were allocated to the cruise missile contacts approaching from the south, fast, maneuvering threats that required an interceptor with a terminal agility to match. The Shahed formation from the west, numerous and low, was assigned to a combination of SM-2 missiles for the outer engagement layer and the evolved Sea Sparrow missile system for closer-in engagements, with Rolling Airframe Missile and the close-in weapon system as the final defensive layers if anything penetrated that far. The allocations were completed and transmitted to the network at 3:11 a.m. The tactical action officer looked at the inventory numbers on her display. The math was workable. Barely. If the threat counts held at current assessed numbers and no additional launches were detected, the defensive inventory was sufficient. She noted the word "if" and set it aside. She could not plan against uncertainty. She could only execute against what the sensors showed. At 3:14 a.m., the first SM-3 launched from the cruiser USS Bunker Hill. The launch plume lit the pre-dawn sky over the Gulf for 3 seconds, a white column rising vertically before the missile's second stage ignited and the weapon tilted onto its intercept trajectory. Inside Bunker Hill's CIC, the engagement controller, watched the missile's track symbol separate from the ship's own position and begin its climb toward the predicted intercept point at the boundary of the atmosphere. The fire control system calculated a probability of kill for the assigned track and displayed it on his console. He did not look at the number. It was a statistical abstraction, and the threat was a physical reality. He watched the symbols converge. 4 SM-3 missiles were in flight simultaneously by 3:15 a.m., each assigned to one of the 7 ballistic tracks. The remaining 3 tracks were assigned to a second salvo that the system was already preparing. At 3:15 a.m. and 44 seconds, The first intercept occurred at an altitude above the atmosphere where the kill vehicle separated from its booster and struck the reentry vehicle with a closing velocity that translated kinetic energy into a debris cloud that the radar system logged as a successful intercept and immediately removed from the threat display. 3 more intercepts followed in the next 90 seconds. 3 tracks remained. The second salvo launched at 3:16 a.m. 2 of the 3 remaining ballistic tracks were engaged and intercepted successfully. The third track, the one that would become the most discussed engagement of the night in every post-mission analysis conducted over the following weeks, performed a terminal phase maneuver at an altitude of approximately 40 kilometers that changed its predicted impact point by 11 kilometers from the fire control system's pre-maneuver calculation. The SM-3 assigned to this track had been targeted against the original predicted impact point. The maneuver occurred after the interceptor's seeker had committed to its terminal guidance phase. The SM-3 missed by a margin that the engagement controller logged as outside lethal radius. The tactical action officer received the miss notification at 3:17 a.m. She had already anticipated it. The track's maneuver had been visible on her display for the past 20 seconds, and the intercept geometry had been degrading in real time. She had a second SM-3 in reserve for exactly this contingency. She authorized the engagement at 3:17 a.m. and 4 seconds. The second interceptor launched. The maneuvering reentry vehicle continued its terminal descent. The interceptor climbed to meet it. The engagement played out in the cold silence of the upper atmosphere, while 5,000 people on the ships below it existed in a state of complete unawareness of the specific physics being resolved above them. At 3:18 a.m. and 22 seconds, the second SM-3 struck the maneuvering reentry vehicle at an altitude of 18 kilometers. The debris field was assessed as not posing a threat to surface vessels. The tactical action officer logged 7 of 7 ballistic tracks as intercepted and shifted her full attention to the western axis, where the Shahed formation had closed to the outer SM-2 engagement boundary during the 4 minutes she had been managing the ballistic engagement. The Shahed 136 is not a sophisticated weapon. Its airframe is simple. Its guidance system uses GPS and inertial navigation without the terminal seeker complexity of more advanced cruise missiles, and its small warhead is designed for targets far less hardened than a naval vessel's armored citadel. What makes it dangerous is not its individual lethality, but its arithmetic. 31 Shahed platforms approaching simultaneously across a spread formation that covers 30 nautical miles of front present a targeting problem that is fundamentally about quantity, about whether the defensive systems can generate sufficient engagement rate to defeat the formation density before the forward elements reach the ship. The SM-2 engagements began at 3:17 a.m. The fire control system prioritizing the closest and most direct tracks in the formation, while the outer elements continued their approach. Missiles left the vertical launch cells of the destroyer, USS Gravely, in a sequence that the ship's crew felt as a series of sharp, percussive thuds transmitted through the hull. Each launch a physical event that reminded everyone aboard that the abstractions on the tactical display corresponded to real weapons in real air. 11 SM-2 missiles fired. 11 Shahed contacts removed from the threat picture. The formation was thinning, but it was not stopped. The remaining 20 contacts continued west, spreading further as their guidance systems executed the dispersion pattern their operators had programmed before launch. At 3:19 a.m., the ESSM engagement layer activated. The evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, faster and more agile than the SM-2 at close range, began working the forward edge of the surviving formation. 8 more contacts were removed. 12 remained when the ESSM layer had exhausted its first allocation and required reloading. 12 contacts at a range now measured in miles rather than nautical miles. The Rolling Airframe Missile systems on the carrier and its escorts began engaging. The characteristic sound of the ram system firing, a rapid mechanical cycling that personnel on deck describe as similar to a very large automatic weapon, became audible to crew members who were topside for damage control station assignments. At 3:21 a.m., 4 Shahed platforms penetrated the ram engagement layer. 2 were acquired and destroyed by the close-in weapons system of USS Gravely, whose phalanx system had been tracking the formation for 6 minutes and engaged at its maximum effective range. 1 was acquired by Lincoln's own CIWS at a range of less than a mile and destroyed. The 4th Shahed platform, its guidance system locked on the thermal signature of the carrier's flight deck, impacted the deck at 3:22 a.m. on the starboard side aft of the island structure, in a section of the flight deck that was not occupied by personnel or aircraft at the moment of impact. The warhead detonated on contact. The blast removed a section of non-skid surface approximately 12 meters in diameter, started a fuel fire in a deck drain channel that the ship's firefighting teams had controlled within 4 minutes, and damaged the hydraulic system of an FA-18 parked 40 meters from the impact point beyond immediate repair. No personnel were injured by the detonation. The carrier's flight operations were suspended for 19 minutes while the deck damage was assessed and the fire was fully extinguished. The tactical action officer noted the impact at 3:22 a.m. in the same flat, clipped tone she had used for every other engagement event in the past 14 minutes. Her voice did not change. Her hands did not change. The fire was being handled by damage control teams whose training for exactly this scenario was as extensive as her own training for the air warfare coordination problem she was still managing. The cruise missile contacts from the south were still active. The 2 anti-ship cruise missiles approaching from the southern axis had been tracked continuously since their initial detection and had been assigned to SM-6 interceptors that launched from the destroyer, USS Michael Murphy, at 3:18 a.m. The SM-6 is a weapon with terminal active radar homing, which means that in its final engagement phase, it navigates autonomously to its target without requiring continuous guidance from the launching ship, a characteristic that frees the fire control system to manage other engagements simultaneously. Both SM-6 missiles were in terminal guidance phase at 3:21 a.m. The first cruise missile was intercepted at 3:21 a.m. and 40 seconds, its debris field falling into the Gulf 32 miles south of the strike group. The second cruise missile performed a pop-up maneuver in its terminal phase, a tactic designed to complicate intercept geometry by changing altitude at the last moment. The SM-6 matched the maneuver. The intercept occurred at 3:22 a.m. and 11 seconds, 11 miles south of Lincoln's position. At 3:23 a.m., the tactical display showed no active threat tracks. The engagement had lasted 14 minutes and 52 seconds from the first SM-3 launch to the last SM-6 intercept. In those 14 minutes and 52 seconds, the strike group's defensive systems had fired a combined total of 41 interceptor missiles across 4 different weapon systems, had coordinated engagements across 5 ships using a shared tactical picture, and had reduced a 31 platform saturation attack plus 7 ballistic tracks plus 2 cruise missiles to a single warhead detonation on a flight deck section that, in the tactical accounting of naval combat, represented the minimum possible consequence of a 40-missile attack package that had been specifically designed to overwhelm American defenses. The cost that the adversary had imposed was real. The deck damage required repair that would consume 19 hours of port time at the nearest Allied facility. The FA-18 that had absorbed blast damage was removed from the strike group's available inventory for the foreseeable future. The defensive missile expenditure, 41 interceptors at a combined procurement cost that the Navy's budget office would later calculate at a figure that made senior officers uncomfortable to discuss in open settings, represented a depletion of the strike group's defensive capacity that would require resupply before the group could sustain another engagement of equivalent intensity. The crew of Lincoln had spent 14 minutes and 52 seconds in a state of sustained, high-intensity operational stress that manifests in the hours afterward as a specific kind of physical exhaustion that sleep does not quickly resolve. The damage control teams who had fought the deck fire had done so in full protective equipment in ambient temperatures that registered at that location on the ship as 41 degrees Celsius. They were exhausted in the specific way of people who have been asked to do precise physical work under time pressure in a hostile thermal environment. But the carrier was operational. Its flight deck, once cleared and inspected, was capable of resuming flight operations. Its air wing was intact. Its defensive systems were degraded but functional. The strike group retained the capability to project air power across the region for which it was responsible. The adversary's objective, to demonstrate that the carrier was too expensive to keep in the Gulf, to create imagery of a crippled flight deck that would shift the political calculus in Washington, had been answered with a counter-demonstration, not invulnerability. Nothing that had occurred that morning suggested invulnerability. What had been demonstrated was something different and, from a deterrence perspective, more important, the capacity to absorb the best available saturation attack, take a single hit out of 40 incoming threats, and continue operating. At 5:44 a.m., USS Abraham Lincoln resumed flight operations. The first aircraft off the bow was an FA-18F that had been launched, not in combat, but in the functional act of demonstrating that the deck was clear, the catapults were operational, and the carrier was still a carrier. The pilot who flew that first post-engagement sortie did not know that his launch would be photographed by a surveillance asset and that the image would appear in intelligence assessments in Tehran, in Beijing, in Moscow, and in Washington within hours. He flew because the aircraft needed to fly, and the deck was ready. The message that image carried required no caption. 14 minutes and 52 seconds. 7 ballistic missiles intercepted. 31 Shahed platforms reduced to 1 impact. 2 cruise missiles destroyed. 1 deck fire extinguished. 1 carrier operational at 5:44 a.m. The ocean does not belong to those willing to attack across it. It belongs to those capable of absorbing the attack, extinguishing the fire, clearing the deck, and launching the next aircraft before the adversary has finished counting what it cost them. The deck holds because the crew refuses to let it break.